Hello, everyone on YouTube and its associated platforms and podcasts. I'm talking today to Amala Ekpunobi. She was a radical leftist activist as a young person and has undergone quite a political and philosophical transformation in recent years. And so we're going to talk to her about that and about her work with PragerU today. She's an American YouTube commentator, as I said, working under the PragerU brand. Her channel, Unapologetic, has amassed over 500,000 subscribers in a very short time, by the way, spearheaded initially by her story. Her mother is a left-wing pundit who works on professional fundraising. Amala grew up fully believing in leftist ideology before having a radical change in thought. Recognizing the hate coming from those around her who were tolerant, she made a hard choice to confront her bosses in a leftist organization on these thoughts and was not only shut down, but belittled by being told, "You don't even realize how oppressed you are." And this was the final straw. From here, she left her workplace, dived into her own education on the founding fathers and the institutions as they were originally designed in America and how social media works. Using these new skills in tandem, she launched a conservative TikTok channel of all things and found herself going viral regularly. It wasn't long after she joined PragerU as the host of her own show. Raised in a far-left activist household, 22-year-old Amala Ekpunobi was once a student organizer for the left. Unanswered questions and a search for the truth led her to a complete ideological transformation. Passionately sharing her new conservative values online, Amala became a viral social media sensation. She is now the host of PragerU's popular show, Unapologetic with Amala. She inspires millions of young people every day to discover the truth, defend their values, and lead better lives. I met her at a PragerU gala about a month ago. It's December 2022 at the moment, so a month ago would have put us in November. I think that's about right. And I was there talking to Dennis Prager, and she had a speech after me, and it was really quite compelling, and I thought it would be very interesting to talk to Amala on my podcast as a consequence. She's quite young. She's made a bit of a splash online, maybe more than a bit. And so when I listened to her talk, I thought, well, here's someone who seems to have a clue and who's probably going somewhere. So let's find out exactly who she is. And so that's the plan today. I want to get to know her a little bit and to walk all of you through it. So let's start with what you're doing now. You're working for PragerU, and that's a very evil thing to do, as you know full well. And so I'm quite curious about how that came about. And how old are you?
I'm 22 at the moment.
Right. Okay. So you're not a pup. But you're out of that. You're out of puphood a little bit, anyways.
Yeah.
So okay, how did you come to start doing videos for Prager? Tell me exactly what you're doing at PragerU.
Sure. Yeah. So at the moment, my job title is PragerU personality, which I guess assumes that I have some sort of personality. And what that involves now is I do podcasting and social media content and just talk about cultural issues, today's politics and news from a young person's perspective, and particularly a young conservative-leaning perspective. So that's what I do now. And PragerU found me because I started making videos on the internet about a journey that I had from being what I consider to be a really radical leftist to a now sort of right-of-center person.
Right. So you're a conservative personality. That those two words haven't gone together that well during the entire span of my life. So that's kind of a funny thing altogether. And so how often are you making videos for Prager?
Every single day we put out content. So we're constantly staying on our toes and keeping up with everything that's going on in the world. And that's our daily life right now, is just looking at what's happening, looking at the conversations that people are having and what's trending, and then hopefully giving a reasonable perspective on it.
Right. So how much content are you producing every day?
At least, I would say 3 short-form videos that are about 60 seconds long, as well as 1 long-form video that will be anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. And then we do a live podcast on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays that goes for about an hour.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And on the short form, So those are about 60 seconds long?
Yep. We'll pick a trending topic or a news story and then just give you a 60-second rundown of what's happening as well as a little bit of opinion on it.
Right. And so what platforms are you using for the short forms?
Everything. We're on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, you name it, we're there.
Are you on TikTok?
Yes, TikTok. I have an up and down relationship with TikTok as I get banned probably every other week for the content that I put out.
Well, congratulations. Being banned by the Chinese communists is always a really good thing. Yeah. We should return the favor in spades. Yes.
I agree.
Yes, definitely. And so where do you have the biggest following?
My biggest following is now on YouTube. My TikTok account is currently banned. That would have been my biggest following at about 640K, I believe. But now we've reached that on YouTube.
Oh, well, congratulations. And how fast are you growing on YouTube?
Well, we started our channel, I want to say, about in April of this year. So that's how quickly. It's been about 9 months.
And you said you were making videos before Prager picked you up. And what platforms were you using for those videos? When did you start doing that?
I started out on TikTok of all platforms, and I want to say I started there at the end of 2019. And I, in a matter of months, managed to amass a few 100,000 followers because I think I was speaking to a perspective that people weren't used to on the platform. And I have a particular look, being a biracial female. I think that's not to be ignored in it having a factor in me growing so quickly on these platforms. But TikTok is where things really started to take off.
Shopify is the all-in-one commerce platform trusted by millions of entrepreneurs to create their online store and so much more. Shopify makes it simple to sell to anyone from anywhere. Whether you're selling succulents or stilettos, start selling with Shopify and join the platform simplifying commerce for millions of businesses worldwide. With Shopify, you'll customize your online store to your brand, discover new customers, and build the relationships that will keep them coming back. Shopify covers all the sales channels to successfully grow your business, from an in-person POS system to an all-in-one e-commerce platform, even across social media platforms like TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks to 24/7 support and free on-demand business courses, Shopify is here to help you succeed every step of the way. It's how every minute, new sellers around the world make their first sale with Shopify, and you can too. Sign up for a free trial at shopify.com/JBP. Go to shopify.com/JBP to start selling online today. That's shopify.com/JBP.
Yeah, so what do you think you were doing that made what you were saying relevant and vital to people? I mean, you pointed to a couple of things, your youth and your biracial status, and I suppose the combination of those two things and the fact that you were offering a counter-narrative, but that doesn't seem to me to be enough. Like, when you see that kind of explosive growth across multiple platforms, you have to think that you're saying something in the right way for the moment. And so what is it about what you're doing that is attracting attention? Is it mostly positive attention? Are you getting a lot of trouble? And so that would also be in your personal life as well as your online life, because those aren't the same thing. So what are you doing right?
What am I doing right? That's a big question. When I started out on the platform, it was just a leisurely thing. I unfortunately had downloaded TikTok as a form of entertainment and started scrolling through this curated For You page, which of course takes in your demographics and realizes somewhat of who you are as a person and then feeds you videos that they think you'll like. And the videos that I was being fed were just a lot of leftist radical ideology, really reducing me down to my gender, my race, talking about how pivotal it was that I was to be a member of the feminist movement or of Black Lives Matter. And I saw that and thought, wow, it's very interesting that this app took in my demographics and this is what it fed me. I wonder if there's anybody saying anything contrary to this. So one day I took out my phone and I filmed a video talking about how I used to be a former leftist and now I'm on the other side of things, and that part of me sort of died off but spoke to it a little bit, and my videos started taking off purely due to hatred. People were very upset at me espousing these views. I was called a race traitor, an Uncle Tom, a coon. I got every single name you can think of for what I was doing, and then with that
that's fun.
hatred came Yeah. It was something that I expected by virtue of having been on that side of things already. I knew what I was going to walk into with that. But with that came just this wave of support of people seeing the hate that I was getting and wanting to be a part of the counter narrative of that.
Right. Well, that's interesting because it's certainly been the case that in respect to my rise to notoriety, let's say, the most vitriolic attacks have been the ones that have done me the most good.
Certainly.
And that's pretty weird, you know. It isn't necessarily how you look at life, but the first video that really went viral in relationship to my political activity, I had put up a couple of videos criticizing the University of Toronto's idiot HR policies, you know, predicated on diversity, inclusivity, and equity, and their half-begotten, dimwit interpretation of human psychological functioning. The idea that you could use explicit anti-racist training to overcome implicit racist bias, which is like the most preposterous thing ever from a psychological perspective. I criticized that in this compelled speech law in Canada. Then some activists cornered me. I'd been speaking at a free speech rally, which I didn't arrange, by the way. And I got a lot of trouble there, a lot of white noise generation, a lot of almost violent pushback from the hypothetical radical left. And then a bunch of activists cornered me on the way in to my building, my office building, and they filmed it, the encounter, talking about all the Nazis that were at my free speech rally. And first of all, I don't know what it's like in the United States at the moment, although I've been there quite a bit. There aren't any Nazis in Canada. That's just not a Canada thing. I don't know anyone who knows anyone who's ever met anyone who claims to be a Nazi. Like, it's just not an issue. And so that was completely preposterous. Anyways, they filmed this encounter, you know, claiming that I was attracting all sorts of demented right-wingers, and that went viral. The idea was to damage my reputation, but exactly the opposite happened. And then I've had a number of encounters with journalists that have been definitely, the journalists were just, they're real vipers, you know, they're the sort of people. In fact, one of them eventually admitted that this is what she was doing. This was Nellie Bowles, who used to work for the New York Times. She actually wrote an apology, a public apology, although not specifically to me, saying that as a New York Times journalist, she made her career by going out to purposefully destroy people. And so talking to journalists like that, it's really like, it's like walking through a nest of vipers, because the people who do that sort of thing ask their questions in a way that is designed to make you say something that will be fatal to your reputation permanently, so that their status can be elevated as the person that outed you. But interestingly enough, just to wrap this story up, is every time that's happened, although it made things shaky for a couple of weeks or a couple of months afterwards, the positive consequences have eventually been far greater than the negative consequences. And so that being attacked, you know, that can be well, first of all, it forces you to get your arguments in line. But it also can be a real, well, as you said, you know, your sense is that had you not been subject to all that abuse, you probably wouldn't have grown as quickly.
Yeah, all of the pivotal moments in what has been a very, very short career so far have been when people have come at me with hatred and vitriol and painted this really evil picture of me. And then people who want to believe that and want to see what I have to say in order to throw hate at me end up finding my message and eventually having this reaction of, wow, she's really not that bad. Because I understand the people that I speak out against, I come forward and say, here's why you believe what you believe. And with everything you're seeing right now, I completely understand it because I was there. I'm not going to shout at you about how you're stupid or brainwashed because, you know, that was me 4 years ago even. So I try to approach all the conversations I have with that perspective. So people are expecting to meet this really evil, bulldog, abrasive individual. And then they find my videos and go, oh, that's not at all what these hate comments were saying. It's totally different.
Yeah, well, so when this first viral video went out, I already had about 150 hours of YouTube content up because I posted a lot of my lectures because I was playing around with YouTube at that point, trying to figure out how useful it was as a broad communication platform. And so what happened, again, parallels your experience, was people went to check out my YouTube video because they were assuming that I was, foaming at the mouth, and found out that, well, this is actually literally the case. I probably have 200 hours of lectures up, might be more than that now. And the people who've been interested, say, in mischaracterizing me and also in taking me out, haven't been able to find in all of those hours one single statement that, even taken out of context, would indicate that, I have any of the nefarious notions or motivations that have been ascribed to me. And so what's so interesting about that, it's really powerful in a paradoxical way, because people go looking for you, let's say, assuming that you're some kind of junior monster. So not only do they find out that's not true, they find out that the opposite is true. And so then they find out that you're being pilloried not only by people who are lying and who are corrupt and malevolent because of their lies, but they're doing something worse than lying, because, if you're a skillful liar, you tell a lie that's very close to the truth, right? Because it can kind of slip by. But there are anti-truths, which are different than lies, and an anti-truth is something that couldn't be farther away from the truth if you tried to make it farther away. And so you had the benefit of that, is that you were pilloried by people who were telling anti-truths about you. And then people come and see, oh my God, she's nothing like I was led to believe. And then that starts to raise serious doubts in the back of their mind. It's like, just what the hell's going on here? Because this isn't just a lie. This is the complete opposite of reality itself. So that's very interesting too. It's very interesting to watch that emerge. All right, so you started working on TikTok, and you started to get a lot of hatred and then a lot of attention. What happened after TikTok?
Within a matter of months, I received a message on my Instagram from somebody working here at PragerU, and they said, we've seen your videos, and we're very interested in you coming out here and telling your story. Is it possible that we could get you on a call? And I got on a call and told my story over the matter of a couple of minutes. And they said, let's fly you out to Los Angeles, and we want you to do a video for a series we have called Stories of Us, where you sit for an hour, you tell us your story, and we will chop that up and put that out to the internet. And I got here, I met with many of the higher ups who were working here, and on the second day of my trip was offered a job. And they said, would you like to come here and do this full time? Start making your videos and putting them out on social media, and we'll support you and resource that for you. And at the time, that had really not crossed my mind. I was working at a medical clinic as a tech and had every intention of continuing my schooling and going into nursing and midwifery. So I thought about it for a second and thought, this is a pretty important opportunity that I get, and that is just sitting at my feet right now, and I'd be pretty dumb to not take them up on it. So I dropped everything and moved out to LA within a matter of weeks.
Yeah, well, good for you. I mean, yeah, when opportunity comes knocking like that, then, it's sensible to take advantage of the situation in the most positive possible way. What's it been like working with the Prager crew?
Oh, it's been great. I think the best thing about working here is that I have freedom to really talk about whatever I want to talk about on any given day. And I think it's very rare to have a job that supports you in that sense. So I really wake up every day and get to look at things that I'm passionate about speaking about, and then bring that to the forefront for other people to hear. There's certainly a lot of pressure that comes with it, as I'm sure you feel as well. You want to be on the right side of things. You want to speak to things that are true. And that can be difficult because we make mistakes and sometimes we're wrong. And I'm very young to be doing this, so that's something that stays on my brain a lot. But other than that, it's a really great job.
How do you keep your ego under control?
Because I know how fallible I am as a human being. I think that's what keeps me in control. And I try to stay hyper aware of my shortcomings and my blinders. And I really approach things with the sense that I could be wrong about anything I'm saying on any given day. And I want to have that sort of care for myself, so I'll give that care to other people. And it really keeps me humble, because there's many times where I'm wrong, or I'll come at a subject matter feeling super defensive about it or needing something to be right, and I don't realize that until far later. So I try to keep that in mind whenever I'm doing anything.
Men, is it time to stop mindless scrolling? Time to finally gain that higher quality of life you know you're missing out on? If this sounds familiar, then on January 9th, join thousands of men all over the world to embark on a 90-day journey together in search of a better life. It's called Exodus 90, and it was built to help men enjoy the freedom of becoming who they were truly made to be. Exodus 90 guides you in removing the attachments that are holding you back from a better life. And it actually works. Independent research shows that Exodus 90 men report considerable shifts after the first 90 days, including stronger satisfaction rates in their marriages, more meaningful prayer lives, and dramatic decreases in time spent on their phones. For the past 7 years, Exodus has helped more than 60,000 men build a roadmap for living with virtue in a culture that offers far too many paths to self-destruction. Is it time for your Exodus? We start January 9th. Find resources to prepare for Exodus at exodus90.com/Jordan. That's exodus90.com/Jordan.
Yeah, well, it hasn't been that long since you've done a 180 on your belief system, and so that's also got to be kind of paramount in your mind. Let's talk about that a little bit. So, when I was a kid, 14, I worked with a woman named Sandy Notley and her husband, Grant Notley. And Grant was the member of the Legislative Assembly for my home constituency, my riding in Fairview. And he was the only opposition member in the entire Alberta Parliament, essentially. And he was a socialist. The entire province was conservative, except for him. He was a socialist. Now, the reason he was elected in that riding wasn't because he was a socialist. In fact, he was elected, I would say, in spite of the fact that he was a socialist. But he was actually a good man, and everybody knew that and trusted him. And so I worked for the NDP, the New Democratic Party, for about 3 years. And I was a good friend of his wife. She was the librarian at our local junior high school, and she introduced me to serious literature. And I really liked her. She was a real good mentor. Kind of an eccentric New England woman, quite well educated by the standards of the little town that I grew up in. And so she pointed me to Huxley and Orwell and Solzhenitsyn and Ayn Rand as well, to her credit, because, of course, Rand is no socialist. And then, you know, because I had access to her and her husband Grant was the leader of the socialists in Alberta, he had access to premiers of Alberta provinces and the national leader of the NDP. And over about a 3-year period, I got to be a fly on the wall in many meetings between senior labor leaders and senior socialist leaders. It's this kind of Fabian socialism that's got a British twist. It isn't really derived from the same, say, school of thought that the communists were derived from. And I stopped working for them when I was about 17 for reasons that I'll go into. But I got to say a few things about the socialists of that time. First of all, most of them had been labor leaders. You know, so a lot of them were working class guys, mostly guys, not all, mostly, and this was the leaders, who had worked themselves up the working class hierarchy and then had adopted political responsibilities of one form or another. And most of those guys, when I listened to them, I actually had a fair bit of respect for them and admired them. I actually thought that they were genuinely doing their best to put forward the interests of the working class. And at that time, the Conservative Party in Canada was pretty much middle class, upper middle class guys in three-piece suits, you know, banker types. It was clear the Conservative Party was a voice of the corporate world. And then the Liberals, who were genuine centrist Liberals, sort of played both ends against the middle, and they did that quite successfully. So everybody knew where the political parties stood in some real sense. They were different, and the socialists did advocate for the working class. But even then, you know, I used to go to the party conventions, and there were a lot of activists there. And I didn't like the activists at all. They really made me nervous. I thought, And then I read George Orwell, and George Orwell talked about socialist activists back in the 1930s in the UK. What did he call them? Tweed-wearing, leather patch jacket, champagne socialists. It's like, well, what the hell do you guys have to do with the poor? And the answer was nothing. You don't love the poor, you just hate the rich. Now, the leaders I saw, they liked the working class. You know, they were advocating on their behalf. But these activist types, they were motivated by pretty much nothing but resentment. And that really grated on me. And I stopped working in anything that was political, pretty much from that point onward. So I think it's really easy for young people to be attracted to leftist ideas because, first of all, young people are looking for a cause. And second, without much reflection, it seems obvious that we should be advocating for the oppressed. And then, of course, the leftists always say that that's what they're doing. And so, given that your first moral impulse might be to advocate on the part of the disaffected, then it seems appropriate that if you were attempting to be moral, that you would gravitate towards those who claim to be speaking for the dispossessed. The question is, are they really speaking for them? So why do you think, now you also have said, and you need to explain this to people, that your mother was and is a left-wing political activist. But so you have that reason for having been hooked into the ideology, let's say. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? Let's walk through your biography a bit here and talk about the philosophical reasons you were attracted to it and also the personal reasons that this particular ideology.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised by a single mother for much of my life. My parents divorced when I was around 6 years old. So my mom took care of me and two siblings. And through her single motherhood, really, I was super involved with her work. If we got a day off school, we were going to go to work with mom, and I was going to see exactly what she was doing. And what she was doing was fundraising for a left-leaning organization out in Orlando, Florida. So that was her day in and day out. She's politically quite obsessed with virtually everything that's going on in today's day and age. So I would go to work with my mom, and she would give me markers to write on posters. Little did I know those posters were going to be used in protests that they were staging in the city. So very deeply entrenched in that from a really young age. And my mom happens to be white, which I don't find to be particularly important, but it is important in that she taught me from a really young age that because I was biracial, life might be a little bit harder for me living in this country due to its history and how that history is reflected in the present. So I think more so than doing good for the world, I was attached to this sense of victimhood, and I thought that it was really pivotal to my identity. So I was a really angry young person. I was getting in arguments all the time with kids who knew nothing about politics, about political issues. And I grew up in a very small, rural, conservative town. So arguments were ripe for the picking with anybody I chose. And anger was the first thing that I think got me attached to the movement. But then it was going to my mother's work. And like you said, there was a lot of working class people involved. During the hurricanes in Florida, they would do food banking and give out food to the needy. So it was a lot of very radical policy prescription mixed in with pretty pragmatic helping of people who happen to be lower income and living in lower income communities. So I think I just got my wires crossed in thinking that because we were doing good on a small scale, that meant that these radical prescriptions that we were calling for were also good.
Yeah, well, that's a critical point, because, okay, so let's delve into that a little bit and think it through. So,
Sure.
Look, it's definitely the case that one of the sources of sophisticated morality is compassion, right? Although we're making a big mistake in the modern world by elevating compassion to what would you call status of unique virtue, because there's lots of other more primordial building blocks of virtue that are as important as compassion. So, for example, everyone's enjoined now to not be judgmental. And that really means to be casually dismissive, and I do think casually dismissive is a mistake, but judgmental, discriminating, that's not a mistake, that's a virtue. Because to be judgmental and to be discriminating means that you dispense with what isn't worthy and you pursue what is worthy. And truthful is a virtue. And we can start with that. Sensitive to beauty is a virtue. All of those things have to be melded into higher order virtues. But compassion leaps out to dominate. And so it's easy to assume that if you're motivated by something like a reflexive compassion, that everything you think and want is therefore both good, practical, necessary, and morally justifiable. Worse than that, and this might be the most toxic element of it, is that if you believe that you're motivated by compassion, and compassion is the highest virtue, and then you run into anyone who opposes your views, then it's super easy to demonize them. And
yes,
that's also a huge problem. Now, I think that's rooted to some degree in the neurology of maternal compassion. So think about it this way. When you're a mother of a young infant, you should be 100% compassionate. So let's say 0 to 6 months, because the infant is completely helpless. They can't move. So an infant can't be autonomous at all before that young person is capable of voluntary movement, right? So there's just no autonomy without voluntary movement. So till children can crawl, they're completely dependent on their mother. And what that means is their mother has to be 100% compassionate, because everything the child wants when it's in that infantile stage has to be dealt with no argument, 100% of the time. And so, and more than that, so because the child is so vulnerable, the cost of labeling something as a predator that isn't a predator is very low. But the cost of labeling something that is a predator, not a predator, is very high. And so along with that overarching compassion comes this proclivity to overlabel things as predatory. And that's protective. But it does not scale well into the political landscape. Like, I don't think that we can scale an ethos of compassion. I don't think you can actually scale it beyond the family. Ben Shapiro, I was talking to him about this recently, and he said something quite witty, which was that, well, at home he's a communist, right, with his kids. Well, it's from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Sure.
And that's right, because with your children, you're trying to keep things equitable in terms of outcome even, and you are calling on them to deliver what they can, and you provide to them what they need. And then it's an open question, especially if you're not particularly mature in your thinking. It's an open question, well, why can't we use exactly those principles to govern, well, large corporations or educational institutions or the world as a totality? And the answer to that seems to me to be something like the most fundamental feminine ethos does not scale. It's a local ethos. It's for infants and family members, fundamentally. Yep. And I think that's associated on the personality front with the distinction between agreeableness and conscientiousness. So agreeableness is the compassionate, temperamental dimension. And women are more agreeable than men, quite reliably, although the difference isn't huge. It's big at the extremes, but it's not huge. It's not particularly large in the middle. If you pick a random man and a random woman out of the population and you asked which one was more compassionate, if you picked the woman, you'd be right 60% of the time. But you'd be wrong 40%. So you can see that there's still a lot of overlap. But agreeableness does not predict success in the broader world. Conscientiousness does. And conscientiousness is a much colder virtue, right? Because a conscientious person will call you out on your misbehavior even if it hurts your feelings, let's say. And a conscientious person is someone who will forestall immediate pleasure or even undergo a certain amount of immediate discomfort for a longer-term gain. And our well-functioning institutions seem to be predicated on an ethic of conscientiousness and not an ethic of compassion. And I don't think we've got that straightened out at all. Like, we certainly don't communicate that idea to young people. Say, look, there's a place for compassion, but it's the local. And it's the local and infantile in some sense. And then that brings up another question, and nobody's been able to have a serious discussion about this, is women have really entered the political sphere en masse in the last 60 years, let's say.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody would dispute that particular idea. And we know there's all sorts of masculine political pathologies, right? Maybe overt proclivity towards a kind of aggressive narcissism that might result in the creation of stupid wars for egotistical reasons. That might be an expression of masculine psychopathology on the political front. But we haven't had a serious discussion at all about feminine psychopathology on the political front. And I think we miss a whole, I've been trying to formulate it as something like narcissism of compassion. The idea that just because you're feeling maternal, that your love can envelop the whole world, and now by fiat, all your political opinions are correct merely because, you feel sorry for kittens. So right. I'm not making light of that, right? Well, you get that, exactly. That sort of, that reflexive compassion is not a moral virtue. And the reason for that is that moral virtues are a lot more sophisticated. Okay, so we've gone over some of the ideas why young people might be attracted to the compassionate ideal. Now, you used to go to work with your mom. You were pulled into this. She had, okay, and then, so when did the cracks start to show? And you were getting in a lot of arguments. That's interesting, too, as an activist type, because that's a weird loop to be in, too, because your mother was teaching you, according to your own testimony, let's say, to view yourself as a victim, for, let's say, for your racial status, even though she was white herself. And that also compelled you to argue with people. And my suspicions are that, why wouldn't that reinforce your feeling of alienation and isolation? Like, you know what I mean? So were you in a loop because of that?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. It was a complete loop of believing this, getting into an argument with somebody that reinforced the ideas that I already had. And at every fork in the road that I had come to with that was a little hypocritical, or maybe there's something wrong there. I didn't seek out trying to find the cracks in what I was believing. I just sought reinforcement. So whenever I was in an argument with somebody, it wasn't really about the crux of what I was saying or what I was advocating for. It was always, they're a racist, they're a misogynist, so anything that they say doesn't even matter, and I shouldn't even take into account as far as questioning my own self and having a healthy degree of skepticism. So I was in this constant loop of, yes, I believe this is what my identity is. If somebody argues with me, it's because they're not on the same page as me and they in fact hate something about my identity, and it just looped back and forth for years.
Start the new year off right with Black Rifle Coffee. Black Rifle has all the best brewing gear, thermoses, mugs, and apparel designed for folks who love country and coffee. Black Rifle sources the most exotic roasts from around the globe. All coffee is roasted here in the U.S. by veteran-led teams of coffee experts. Every purchase you make with Black Rifle helps support veteran and first responder causes. Go to blackriflecoffee.com and use promo code Jordan for 10% off coffee, coffee gear, and apparel. Or join the Black Rifle Coffee Club for automatic deliveries to your door on your schedule. Save 10% with promo code Jordan. That's blackriflecoffee.com, promo code Jordan. Black Rifle Coffee, supporting veterans and America's coffee.
Well, people who are listening might be asking, well, why should you subject your own beliefs to criticism? And like when I wrote my first book, which was called Maps of Meaning, I spent a lot of time writing it, but then I spent a lot of time with hammer and tongs trying to break every sentence. So I'd read a lot of Nietzsche by that point, and Nietzsche described himself as someone who philosophized with a hammer. And so what he meant by that, first of all, was that he was capable of delivering devastating philosophical blows, which is certainly the case. I don't know if there's ever been a philosopher who was more explosive than Nietzsche in the psychological and social sense. But it also meant that whenever he put forward a proposition, he would spend a tremendous amount of time trying to throw every possible argument he could formulate at that proposition to see if he could break it. And then he'd only keep the propositions he couldn't break. So I tried to do that with Maps of Meaning. I figure I rewrote every sentence about 50 times, trying to see is there any argument I can come up with that will get underneath this proposition and make it feel weak and unsteady to me? And I only kept Now, you might say, well, why bother with all that? Why not just be comfortable in your beliefs? And the answer is, look, there's going to come in your time in your life, for sure. Might happen every day to some degree, where what you believe and how you predicate your actions is going to be subjected to unbelievably severe stress. And that might be in an argument, or especially if the argument gets vicious and intense, or if it's a long-term argument in a relationship, or it might be that you encounter something tragic in your life. If your beliefs aren't stress tested, like in some serious manner, then they're going to fall apart just when you most need them, and then you're going to be in serious trouble. So finding yourself in one of these loops where you don't test your beliefs and you just discount everything that might be a challenge because of the hypothetical, quasi-satanic nature of the person who's questioning you, means that you're allowing yourself to live inside a house of cards, essentially. And then as soon as you are stressed, in some real sense, you're going to just fall apart. Now, you said you were miserable and angry. And so was that most of the time?
Yeah, it was most of the time, and that could have been due to other factors, but I do think what I believed was really a part of that, and the lack of true testing of what I believed. I think a lot of people misconstrue a test with having a cause of stress, and I think the more you test your beliefs, the more comfortable you will be in them. So now I'm way more comfortable going into back and forth with people and debating, whereas before I wasn't. And I think it's because I was really insecure in what it was that I believed, but so confident in espousing it and just so strong in being really forthright. I was the person who would wear those activist t-shirts to school every day, knowing that it was going to rile people up and that it was going to cause some sort of discussion to happen. So what really had made me upset in the life that I was leading was just waking up every day, looking at the world through this lens of injustice. Every cross look was racist. Every off comment was misogyny. And when you view the world that way and you're looking for those things, not just saying that you believe that they are real, but looking for them, everything you see is going to be that thing. So the world was a really evil place.
Right. Well, you also put yourself in a position. Yeah, that's interesting too, because you put yourself in a position then when casual interactions, let's call them microaggressions, for lack of a better word, and casual misunderstandings are instantly elevated in your perception to the status of high moral crimes. So it isn't just that someone's annoyed at you or someone's just having a bad day. It's that you're dealing with a racist or a misogynist, right? Which is a core evaluation of their character.
And I can give you an example of just how bad it was, because people will think about things and go, well, that probably was a microaggression, and that probably was racism. But I was so obsessed with it that as a kid, I had learned that if somebody wanted to touch my hair, which was very curly and very odd for the place that I was living in because I was surrounded by a lot of white people with straight hair, I was told that if somebody asked to touch my hair or somebody came and wanted to look at my braids, that was racism being played out in real time, and that they were trying to express how different I was and really belittle me. So this would happen all the time to me in school. Kids would walk up and go, "Oh, I love your curly hair. Can I touch your hair?" And that was evil to me. That was racism shining right in my face. So you can imagine probably how bad that was for me, believing these things as a young person.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely. Now, interesting that tone of voice that you used there when you were talking about those kids that would come up to you, when you mimicked them, the way you mimicked them was by what would you call it, acting out the vocal intonations of a curious kid, not as someone who's being mean. And so what do you now think those kids were doing? How do you look at and what do you think would have been a better way for you to look at that when you were a kid?
Oh, the best way I could have looked at that as a child was, oh my gosh, somebody is displaying interest in me. How wonderful
Right,
a
right.
thing that somebody saw something that was different to what they normally saw and felt the need to point that out and to ask me about it. They were genuinely curious about how my hair came to be this way. And if I had viewed the world in that light, I would have been such a happy little child. And unfortunately, I had the exact opposite experience.
Yeah, I read a great book a long while back called Bullying, What We Know and What We Can Do About It. And, we have this idea that bullies find kids who have something abnormal about them and then target them because of that abnormality. But this gentleman, Dan Olweus, great psychologist, pointed out that at least 75% of kids have some obvious, let's call it, deviation from the norm that could be picked out by a bully. It could be something as simple as wearing glasses or having red hair or being a little short or being a little tall or being a little thin or being a little fat. You can just multiply the peculiarities endlessly. And that in and of itself isn't enough to generate bullying. The bullies tend to focus on an identifiable anomaly, but then they're looking for kids who overreact when they're teased a little bit. And then it's that combination of sensitivity, hypersensitivity to provocation, plus perhaps an anomaly that makes someone into a bully victim. And so, well, you can kind of see there, you had this situation where there was something about your hair that made you identifiably different, but the kids could have been both testing you and checking you out in a curious way, and then whether that would spiral into something that would be true bullying and intimidation would be dependent to a large degree on your own reaction.
Yeah, and I've struggled with for a long time of just going back and taking accountability for my part in things. And when I went through this journey of realizing, oh, maybe I don't believe in this leftist sort of woke dogma, a lot of that time I spent blaming other people. Why were people teaching me these things? What institutions were at play when it came to me getting this information? And I took no accountability for my part in being susceptible to the information and what made me want to believe these things. Why was I ripe for the picking as far as a person who was willing to fall for some of the stuff that I was hearing? And that's still something that I'm thinking through to this day.
Well, you did say something interesting, and this is probably worth diving into too. You said that despite the fact that your knowledge was shallow, well, you're not very old, and you weren't, 10 years ago particularly, you weren't very old. Despite your knowledge being shallow, and despite it not being your knowledge, you were very confident about displaying it, and displaying it in some sense proudly. And, pride has always been regarded as one of the cardinal sins. And so it seems to me that part of what set you up for this, apart from the characteristics of your particular background, was also that there was something in it that was an appeal to like a prideful narcissism, right? And I'm not diagnosing you as a narcissist, right?
Sure.
Don't get that wrong. I'm really not. I'm trying to understand why. Well, as you said, Carl Jung said, that every projection needed a hook, and so you always have to ask yourself, even if you were enticed down the garden pathway by woke educators and by your own mother to some degree, what was it in you that helped you respond in a way that made you even more vulnerable to that kind of propagandization than you might have otherwise been? And you said you wore these shirts proudly, you were looking for a fight in some sense. So what do you think was at the bottom of that pride? What were you taking pride in? Was it you standing up for the underdog? Like, what is it that wearing those shirts was doing for you, do you think?
Yeah, I think I felt really different as a child growing up in the environment that I grew up in. And I always felt like I had sticked out regardless of what I did. So I think I just leaned into that a little bit more and thought, okay, well, if I'm going to stick out for these things that I can't control, I'm going to take control of something and I'm going to stand out even more, and couple that with feeling very virtuous for for doing it. I think it was just a recipe for disaster, because it made me feel like I'm a good person doing a good thing, plus I'm standing out, plus all these other people aren't willing to do this good thing that I'm doing, and I get to tell them about it at any given moment. And it was just a mixture of feeling really insecure.
Well, so that's an interesting thing, because we all do believe, I think, in some real sense, that a good person should do good things. And some of that would be a certain amount of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. And if you're sensible about that, you would say, well, you shouldn't sacrifice yourself to the point of being a martyr, because that becomes counterproductive. But the problem with that goodness, I guess this is why there's an injunction in the Gospels against praying in public. The problem with that virtue or that goodness is that you can start to trumpet it as a differentiating moral virtue, right? And so you can start to use your hypothetical care for the poor and oppressed as a marker for your superior social status and the inviolability of your beliefs. And so then it starts to move. You can see that there's a slippery slope there from compassionate virtue to overweening pride. And you said in your case, it was also exaggerated by the fact that, well, man, if you were going to be different, if you were fated to be different in some ways, then by God, you were going to play that hand to its fullest. And that's also an attraction, and an adaptation.
Sure. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. It was just me playing into something, but also being reinforced that it was right all the time. I was super involved in the activism that I was doing. So when I wasn't at school, I'd go to work with my mom and volunteer there. And I ended up graduating high school, and I was so involved that I got a job at her organization. So when we go back to that loop, it was just my own negativity and insecurity, my own willingness to want to be different for the sake of just being different, making myself feel virtuous in doing so, and then being reinforced by the adult structures that were around me for being a young person willing to do the work, which is really so often what we see with the David Hoggs out of March for Our Lives and the Greta Thunbergs. It was just older people saying, this is so great that you're doing it, and you're just like Obama.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people told me at the time.
Oh, my God. Yeah, well, I was thinking about Greta last night, so it might be worth just talking about her a little bit. So I was trying to put myself in her shoes. So imagine, first of all, that you're 13, and then imagine that you're a little on the autistic side. And then imagine that you have a very domineering mother who's perfectly willing to use you for her political purposes. And then, so now she's instilled this terror into you that the world is coming to an apocalyptic end, and that there are evil and malevolent forces conspiring to make that happen. And that basically constitutes the entire patriarchal structure of Western civilization and all of its industry and all of that. So that's the background you come out of. And now you're 13, and you start to parrot some of your mother's ideas. Of course, they're not really her ideas, but they're ideas that have possessed her too. You start to parrot them. Okay, and then what happens? You're 13. Well, what happens is, like 50-year-old adult male leaders all over the world fall at your feet and treat you like you're the Oracle of Delphi. And so then what the hell do you think if you're 13 and confused and a bit autistic and your mother's a bit domineering? You think, oh my God, all these things she's telling me that are so terrifying must be true, because all these well-positioned men who run the world are treating the revelations of my childhood fear as if they're so important that they should be broadcast on every news station and should start to become fundamental government policy. And so, how the hell would you possibly respond if you were 13, except with a massive magnification of your terrors? Like, oh, the world's in such bad shape that I, the 13-year-old autistic child from Scandinavia, now seem to be the leading oracle in the world on the environmental and economic front. It's so sad for her. Like, I can't imagine how someone in that situation couldn't be on the edge of existential terror constantly.
Yeah, I relate to her a lot. And, I feel a lot of compassion and sympathy for her mother as well, because from my perspective with my mom, having gone through this really twisted journey of having to come to her and say, you know what, that stuff that I learned when I was younger really did have a negative effect, and here's how. And her just being shocked in that, oh, I'm so, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was doing the compassionate thing. And I thought I was alerting you to the snake that's sitting out in the front yard. And that's my responsibility as a mother to do that. So I feel for Greta's mother. I feel for her. And I also feel for the people who look at a young person and say, look at this young person leading the way and using the power of a 13-year-old, which is just really very much misplaced to push forward a movement. But it is just a twisted cycle.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's in an impossible situation because I don't see how she could possibly question herself or her doubts, given the unbelievably overwhelming response to her revelations. So she's in an awful situation. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the role that your own temptations played in setting you up for this propaganda, although you were pretty much surrounded by it too, which is, that makes it also very difficult to, let's say, escape from. So how old were you when you started working after schools at your mom's organization? And then how old were you when you started working for her full time?
I was 15 when I had started volunteering and 17 when I started working full-time.
Okay, and you did that after you graduated from high school?
Yes, as soon as I graduated from high school, I thought, no college for me. Let's make myself a full-time activist. and that's what I did, yeah.
Right, well, okay, a couple of things there. So another thing that really used to bother me at the universities, and I started to discuss this with some of my professional peers just before it became impossible for me to continue working at the university. We have this idea that we tell young people all the time, and I really do think this is an insidious invitation to their prideful narcissism, that first of all, that they should be changing the world, which is a lot to change for people who haven't even been able to live independently yet. And also that if you do want to change the world, which is what you should do and what you could do, the way you do that is by being an activist. And activist has become professionalized since the mid-60s. And so an activist seems to me to be someone who hypothetically advocates for the oppressed, which is already a moral danger. It's because, what the hell made you advocate for the oppressed? Did they elect you? Why are you the spokesman? And what gives you that moral virtue? So, those are major questions. But also, it comes with it this temptation, because if you're an activist, you're almost always against something, right? You're against industry, you're against fossil fuels, you're against the patriarchy, you're against the racists. You're always identifying the problem with the world as being something that some other person who isn't good like you is doing. And then what we do is we present young people in high school and in university with the notion that, well, if you really care about the world, there's nothing more honorable than you could possibly do, than to become an activist. And I really kind of think that in some sense, there is almost no lower calling than activist.
Yes, I would agree with you. And I think it's within our nature, especially as young people, to get obsessed with this idea of radical transformation and this lure of transformation. And it wasn't until I met Dave Rubin, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and he put out this quote of, when I was on this side of things, I was trying to control the world. Now that I'm out of it, I'm trying to understand the world. And that's something that a lot of young people are not obsessed with. They don't want to understand the world and their place within it. They feel a sense of discomfort, and they want to attribute that sense of discomfort to something else and find what is a common enemy. And it's really easy to find a common enemy if you listen to anybody who is obsessed with this woke ideology.
Shopify is the all-in-one commerce platform trusted by millions of entrepreneurs to create their online store and so much more. Shopify makes it simple to sell to anyone from anywhere. Whether you're selling succulents or stilettos, start selling with Shopify and join the platform simplifying commerce for millions of businesses worldwide. With Shopify, you'll customize your online store to your brand, discover new customers, and build the relationships that will keep them coming back. Shopify covers all the sales channels to successfully grow your business, from an in-person POS system to an all-in-one e-commerce platform, even across social media platforms like TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks to 24/7 support and free on-demand business courses, Shopify is here to help you succeed every step of the way. It's how every minute, new sellers around the world make their first sale with Shopify, and you can too. Sign up for a free trial at shopify.com/JBP. Go to shopify.com/JBP to start selling online today. That's shopify.com/JBP.
Okay, so maybe someone might level a criticism at you and say, okay, look, for a long time you were a left-wing activist, but now you're just a right-wing activist. And so how would you defend yourself? How do you defend yourself? Because I'm sure that idea has occurred to you. How do you investigate that charge? And what do you think is different about you working for Prager, which is a well-known, hypothetically right-wing, conspiratorial organization, which seems in some sense activist on its surface? How do you distinguish between what you're doing now and what you were doing before? And how do you know that you're not equally deluded, but on the other side of the political spectrum?
Yeah, sure. The way that I know I'm not as deluded as I was before is that I did go through a period of delusion when I recognized that I was not a leftist. I immediately went, oh, well, I must be on the right then. And I self-subscribed myself to the right-wing talking points for quite some time. And then I don't know what happened, but a moment came to me where I went, wait a second, I must have this propensity to just latch myself onto things because I've just done the same thing on the other side. And I really had to look within myself and find where do I truly disagree with my previous self, and where do I agree with my previous self. And there are plenty of back and forth that we'll get into with the employees here at PragerU where we disagree on many things. And that was certainly not an experience that I had when I was working for that left-leaning organization. Now, that could be that organization on its own, making people subscribe themselves all or nothing.
I don't think so.
Right,
Even the
right.
New York Times wrote an article this week talking about how leftist organizations all across the United States are collapsing into themselves because they can't handle any internal dissent. So I think that, one of the things you said about Prager was that you get to say what you want and that you can disagree. And you also implied that, imagine that you're trying to make your way. And so first of all, you're on the left, you have an oversimplified worldview, and then you find out some errors, and then bang, you vacillate over to the right and an oversimplified view, and you find some errors. Like, what you're doing is you're trying to develop a much more differentiated and detail-oriented political philosophy, right? Because that's part of being mature and wise. And so you're going to oscillate back and forth like that. Now, you said you don't think you're merely being an activist now because you're working for an organization where disagreement is it tolerated or encouraged? And do the Prager people do they let you say what you need to say? Do they encourage you to do that? And how do you know that you're not just pulling yourself into alignment with their views for instrumental reasons? I mean, people have asked me the same questions about my work with the Daily Wire, let's say.
Sure. I'd say it's both tolerated and encouraged, and we can be both at the same time. And when I come and do my show, I know that my show is my words and I know that it's my thoughts, and I feel comfortable now, whereas I didn't before, saying, you know what, I don't agree with maybe that 5-minute video that we put out this week, or I don't want to have a certain guest on the show to discuss this sort of view of things. And that is always encouraged and taken to heart, and they go, okay, great. We don't ever want you to put your name on something that is not your thinking or your belief. So I have much more freedom today than I had before when I was working for that left-leaning organization and I was having these thoughts that were dissident to the subscribed narrative. I didn't feel comfortable even saying that or even coming to a point of confrontation with anybody, because I knew that my job was contingent upon me believing the list of things that I was meant to believe. And now I get to come and say, I don't think I agree with you on that. And it's actually taken in stride and people want to talk about it.
Okay. So one of the ways you know that you're not merely towing the party line now is that you have a wider range of play available to you without getting into trouble. Okay, so how else do you know? Here's a good question. How have you learned to distinguish between those words that are yours and those words that merely make you a mouthpiece of an ideology?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not afraid to disagree. I think if I was your typical right-leaning conservative person, I would be talking about, I don't know, Christianity. I don't happen to be a religious person. I'm agnostic atheist, I guess is what you would say. And I always just try to take in information and really deduce down where people are right, where people are wrong on both sides of things. Like I'll take in both narratives, both the left and the right, and see, okay, where are they right on this and where are they wrong and why is that the case? And on the right, where are they right on this and where are they wrong and that's the case? And I take it upon myself to hopefully be even-handed in criticism of both sides. So there will be episodes that conservatives watch my show and they go, I absolutely do not agree with anything you said and here's why. And there's episodes that I put out where leftists disagree with what I have to say. So I don't know that I have a particular process for discerning whether or not I'm truly using the words that come from my own mind, but I can certainly tell that with reaction to the content that I'm saying that, well, I must be saying what's true to myself because I'm pissing off two groups of people equally.
Okay, well that seems to be a reasonable marker. I mean, you also implied something as we talked. You said that when you were a mouthpiece for the party line as a young person, a lot of the time you were miserable and angry and you had a chip on your shoulder and you saw a lot of hostility in the world. And there isn't any evidence of that in the way that you conduct yourself, certainly not in this discussion and not when I saw you on stage. Like you don't seem to be carrying around a lot of bitterness and resentment. And so, I have this byline on my email response, truth is the antidote to suffering. And, one of the things that I think is reasonable is to note that if you are using your own words, that gives you a sense of solidity, internal solidity, and confidence in what you're saying. Like there's an element that's foundational there. It doesn't have that sense of falseness and narcissistic pride that go along with claiming false moral virtue for merely mouthing the dictates of a given ideology.
Sure. You know what? That's a very great point. And that's something that hadn't come to mind. Yeah, I would say I'm far more sound in myself and far more comfortable, I think, with admitting that I was wrong or saying I don't know when it comes to something. Whereas before, you would never hear me say I don't know, which is really scary to think about in retrospect. And now I'm so comfortable looking at an issue and going, you know what? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's two terrors there, right? That there is a terror in not knowing because it means you have to face your ignorance, and there's no shortage of that. But there's also the totalitarian terror, which is the opposite to that, which is, well, if I had my act together, I would have an answer for everything. And that's a hell of a burden, especially when you're 15 or 16. It's like, well, what the hell do you know? And it's hard to understand that there's actually a relief in being able to throw up your hands and say, well, I don't know what the answer to that is, and I could go investigate, but that it's also okay that I don't know, and that opens up doors of exploration for me. But this is something I learned when I was probably about your age, and maybe you'd find it useful. I understood, it was in 1982, 83, something like that. So I was about 21. Yeah, just about exactly your age. I like to win arguments, and I had got a lot of positive attention for being smart and being verbal when I was a kid. And so I had a fair bit of, let's say, intellectual pride, which I doubt I've shaken completely. And I like to be able to win arguments, and I could usually win an argument if I set out to do so. And so I thought that if you won an argument, you were right. And certainly being married has disabused me of that notion, by the way. And and then I realized that I was often saying things just so that I would win arguments and be right. And then I also noticed that when I was doing that, I had a deep sense of falsehood and disquiet, right? And I felt that when I was really paying attention, I could see that doing that made me weak. It made me weak and defensive and prideful and narcissistic, all of those things. And then insistent that I was right and kind of totalitarian. And so then I started to listen to what I was saying and to feel it out. Now, I was reading Carl Rogers at the same time because I was starting to get interested in the clinical world, and he talked about the necessity of authenticity. And he believed that your actions and your words should be in alignment, but not only that your physiological being and your words should be in alignment. He said if you paid enough attention, you could tell when you were, let's say, not being true to your core self, something like that. And for me, that manifested itself as a sense of weakness. And so I kind of learned to feel my way along. I always think about it as sort of trying to find, imagine you're walking across a giant swamp and there are stones under the surface, but you can't see them in the murky water. But you can feel them out. So you can feel where you could step. You could take the next step and find solid ground. And you can do that with your words. You know, you can feel, and I think that's a test for the authenticity and the truth of the words, is that they're not prideful, they're not designed to win, they're designed to provide you with a firm foundation under your feet. And I think to some degree, well, I'm wondering, I suppose, to some degree, if that's how you know, to what degree that's how you know, for example, at PragerU, when you should hold your ground and say what you need to say.
Certainly. And it's interesting because I think I've managed to learn that, at least in the political sense, when it comes to the job that I do. But in a personal sense, I still struggle with exactly what you were talking about, sort of feeling the stones and recognizing things in yourself before the words come out of your mouth. So now politically, because I've gone through all of this back and forth and really having to contend with myself and with other people, now I'm fine and I'm calm and I'll listen to a story and I'll have this idea of, well, let's wait to find more information, even though something immediately wants to attack somebody else. Let's wait and hear more. Whereas sometimes in my personal life, my turnaround on recognizing my defensiveness is about a 24-hour period, which my boyfriend is struggling with right now.
Right. Well, that's interesting. You know, like that's played itself out in our marriage. I would say, I'll talk about my wife momentarily. I would say that when we first got married, the turnaround for her was about 24 hours. And she's got that down to about 30 seconds now.
Yeah. And that's, I hope to be just like her.
well, if you practice that, you know, and if you practice, and it is that kind of, that's humility, by the way, really. It's like, if you listen with humility, you're always listening with the idea that you're probably still pretty stupid, and maybe this person will say something that will make you slightly less stupid if you listen hard enough.
Right.
And that's such a gift, right? Because if you're stupid, you're going to run into a wall because of it at some point. And so if someone who's talking to you can tell you where you're stupid, well, what a deal for you. And the thing that's so interesting about that, too, is that you're way more likely to be told where you're stupid by someone who doesn't agree with you.
Yes, 100%. And it's interesting that when I meet people like protesters who have this very shallow depiction of myself and are telling me that I'm stupid or racist or all these things, for some reason, I treat this person who is so far removed from my life with far more compassion than if somebody who I care about is coming forward and saying, hey, you did this stupid thing. And I don't know if it's because the relationship that I have with the person that is deep and caring has a little bit more sting when criticism is given. And that's why I immediately jump to defense. Whereas with this person, you know, it doesn't truly matter all that much what somebody on a college campus thinks. So it's something that I continue to struggle with, but I've turned a 2-week period of turnaround into a 24-hour one. So
okay, well that's pretty good. Well, it should. Like if you practice that diligently, you can get the turnaround really quick. You know, and that's really, we were talking about the religious front, you know, that's really confession and repentance, by the way. That's a compressed confession. Well, because the confession is, so first of all, you could think about it as recognition of sin. Okay, so what does sin mean? Technically, it means to miss the mark. There's 2 derivations. There's hamartia from the Greek, which was an archery term. So to sin means to miss the mark. And there's one from the Hebrew, which was chet, if I remember correctly. And it also meant to miss the target. So imagine that the religious transformation in its microstructure is something like admission of sin, which is, well, I missed the target. And then there's a confessional element to it, which is, well, here's how I missed the target. I wasn't aiming at the right target, I wasn't careful enough, etc. And then there's the repentance, which is, well, I'd rather not do that again. And then the religious vision, at least on the Christian side, and it's not unique to Christianity, is that if you go through that process of recognition of sin and confession and repentance, then there's redemption. And that is, I really think that's the cycle of growth, right? I don't think you ever learn anything important without going through those four things. That's sort of been routinized and made mythological in the religious context. But it's a useful thing to know, because that's a place where the learning that you're undertaking and your explicit description of the learning and that religious system of ideation, that's a place where they dovetail.
Yeah, and I can imagine pride is the one thing that is standing as a barrier to all of those steps. Yeah. Yeah,
well, good. Well, that's a very astute observation, because the precondition for that cycle of transformation is humility. And, there's my wife prays this Jesus prayer, and I'm going to mangle it because I don't know it that well, but it's something like, Jesus Christ, have mercy on my soul, a sinner. And the Orthodox Christians, some of them pray that continually. And you might say, well, what exactly are they doing? And the answer is, well, they're trying to remind themselves that they're stupid and fallible. And you might say, well, that sucks, because who wants to be reminded constantly that they're stupid and fallible? But if that makes you more attentive and more able to go through this cycle of transformation, because now you're attending to the places where you might be in error, then it's a facilitator of growth. And it is a facilitator of growth to understand that there's a lot more possibility in what you don't know than there is power in what you do know.
Yeah. I'm curious, did you ever struggle with pride getting in the way by virtue of having the job that you have? Because so many people are looking to you and taking in your words as very much right in this very dedicated fashion. Did that ever come as a barrier in your personal life with your own arguments?
Well, I think that I was fortunate, in some sense, because I didn't become well known till I was pretty old. Like, I was in my mid-50s, Mm-hmm. And I'd been a professor at Harvard and at the University of Toronto for 20 years. And so I had a pretty good reputation among my students. And I had some practice at what that was like. And then I developed a bit of a media following in Ontario, and I got a bit of experience on the broader social landscape before things burst forward around me. Now, so I was older when this all happened, and that was helpful. But I also, as I indicated in our conversation, I started to sort a lot of this out when I was about your age, and I realized that I had a lot of intellectual pride, and that's the problem with being smart, is that when you're smart, because you get a lot of positive attention for it, it's really easy to overvalue it, to confuse intelligence with virtue, and to confuse the fact that you're intelligent, let's say, with the idea that you're valuable and good. And that's dangerous, because it means that people who aren't as intelligent aren't as valuable and good, and that's not a very good conclusion to draw. But it also draws you in a prideful way. And like I said, I like to win arguments, and I always thought, well, if I won the argument, I was smarter and better. And I realized around your age that not only was that not true, like seriously not true, because just because someone can't formulate an argument doesn't mean they don't have a point. This is something you definitely learn when you're married. Because your partner might be upset with you and unable to articulate it, and you might be able to mount a pretty damn good defense, but they still might be right, and you should listen. So, because maybe they'll stop you from falling into a pit. But I also started to understand, too, that in that intellectual pride, well, the figure of Lucifer and Satan, Lucifer in particular, so he's a variant of the idea of what's satanic and evil. Lucifer is the morning star and the spirit of enlightenment. And Milton characterized Lucifer as God's highest angel gone most spectacularly wrong. And Lucifer is like Scar in The Lion King. Scar's smarter than Mustafa, but he's alienated and isolated and bitter. And part of that's intellectual pride, a huge part of it. And there's a tremendous intellectual pride in the totalitarian impulse. And so I started to understand that to the degree that I was characterized by intellectual pride and capitalizing on a talent that was given to me in some sense by God, let's say, by the transcendent, because I'm not responsible for my own intelligence, whatever it might be, right? That's just who I am. I didn't do that. I had no more to do with that in some sense than how tall I am. It's just how it is. And then I started to understand that being prideful in that manner was participating in the same process that led to totalitarian atrocity. And then that just scared the hell out of me. I hope. I hope.
Yeah,
I hope
you would
it
hope.
scared me bad.
Yeah.
Well, I hope. Well, you do hope. Well,
Yeah.
my house for years was covered with Soviet paintings, these realist paintings. And a lot of them featured Lenin and Marx and Trotsky, a lot of the real intellectual acolytes of the communist movement. And they were huge paintings. Some of them were 9 by 12. And literally my house was covered with them. And, much to the chagrin of my wife to some degree, although she played along. But part of that was to remember, to remember how attractive these totalizing ideologies can be, how much of a temptation they are to pride, especially allied with something like compassion, and how unbelievably brutal and terrible that is. And so I try to have that in the back of my mind all the time. I want to step forward carefully. I don't want to fall prey to that intellectual or moral pride. And like I said, I'm old enough, so I think I can handle it. And then I would also say, I have a lot of people around me who keep me in check. I have good friends, many of whom have had incredibly successful careers, extremely intelligent people and capable and blunt. And if I deviate, some of them on the left and some of them on the right, and if I deviate, they phone me and say, I don't think you handled that very well. You should get your act together, and then we fight about it. I did a video with Greg Hurwitz and Jonathan Pajot about the tweets that got me banned, where we tried to delve into the utility and morality of my behavior. Twitter makes you impulsive, and I can be impulsive on Twitter. And so, I made some nasty comments on Twitter, and I spent a lot of time talking to my friends and my family about, was that straight and right, or was it prideful and impulsive? And so I have lots of people around me who help. And then I'm hoping I'm terrified enough of where intellectual pride goes to keep my ego in check.
Sure. And there's also this element of being a person who thinks you're always trying to do the right thing, and trying to do the right thing is different from doing the right thing. And I've learned that very recently. And as far as having people who keep you in check, it's been majorly important for me as well. I mean, I've been with a man for a year who now, whenever I do something that is wrong or could even be misconstrued as wrong, he goes, "Hey, I saw that you did this thing." And having so much of your life being filmed, which I'm sure you're accustomed to, it's really something that you have to keep in mind, because one 30-second moment you've had, which would normally be seen by nobody, can be seen by millions, and you will be held to that belief or that statement for the rest of your life, whether or not that's a rightful thing to do or not, with the cancel culture that we're dealing with right now. So to have somebody there to say, you could have said it this way, or I know what you meant to say, but here's how it could have been done better, is just such an important thing to have for everybody.
Yeah. Well, there's advantages to that. I mean, I've been required, let's say, to temper my public behavior in a more civilized manner since I've been in the situation that you described, so there's two elements to that. First of all, if I'm ever rude to anyone who knows me, who knows of me, first of all, they will never forget that for the rest of their life, and they will tell everyone they know. Yep. And you don't need that to happen very many times before your reputation deservedly takes a major hit. So I do my best to be hyper alert when I'm in public, in places that I might be irritated normally, like airports and so forth, because I really don't like airports. And not that anybody particularly does. But it is kind of useful to be called to be on your best behavior all the time like that. But it is definitely useful to have someone around who is watching you and helping you, modify your behavior so that you aren't being impulsive and prideful any more than is absolutely necessary. Yeah, you're going to be in a rough situation, because you're really young, and you do have to, assuming that you're career trajectory stays upward, which seems, reasonably probable barring catastrophe, you're really going to have to watch yourself constantly. And so that could be good, but it's not nothing to have to do that.
Yeah, I think the moments where I'll find the most pressure in it is probably when we're doing live shows, because you never know what's going to come out of your mouth for the most part when you're live. And I have been known to be a very fast-paced person, and that is helpful and hurtful in so many ways. But as far as meeting people, you spoke to something interesting. There are times where you meet people in your most uncomfortable moments in life. And there have been moments where I've been at the hospital seeing a loved one, and someone walks in and wants to say hi, or a nurse or something like that. And it's just so interesting to have to take that in and go, well, this is a moment, and you have to make this moment for this person, despite what's going on in your personal life. And there's something so powerful about having to do that as a person, not to, step out of the realm of humility, but it's very meditative to take on an uncomfortable moment and make it comfortable for somebody else. It's a very powerful thing to be able to do, and a skill that I hopefully have learned.
Yeah, right. Well, it'd be a good skill for everyone to learn, because the idea there is something like you are required to be good regardless of whatever tragedy happens to be unfolding in your life at the moment. And I think that's right. Yep. I mean, part of the reason that people are inclined not to be good, so they become resentful and bitter, is because terrible things have happened to them. And that's genuinely the case. Now, you can blow out of proportion something and find a reason for resentment, but lots of times people have been really hurt. And you might say, well, don't I have a reason to be resentful and bitter? And the answer is, bloody well right, you have a reason to be resentful and bitter. And it might be a good reason, but two things. First of all, that doesn't mean that you get to stop trying to be good. And second, it also doesn't mean that everybody who's had a rough time is now no longer good. Now, in my life, I've met lots of people because I was a clinician and a professor. And now, I've met literally hundreds of thousands of people. But I learned at least 25 years ago that it's often the best people who've been through the worst things. Now, if you go through something terrible, it can really embitter you and take you out and make you malevolent. And you have your reasons. But I've met people who had lives so brutal that they're almost beyond imagining, who were so deep and good that it was literally a miracle to meet them. And I met a lot of people like that. I had people in my clinical practice who were just, Jesus, I had this one woman, she didn't have anything going for her. Like, her family was utterly insane. Her mother was a delusional alcoholic schizophrenic whose boyfriend was paranoid and used to torture her to death about being possessed, literally possessed. She was very intellectually impaired. She was overweight. She was unattractive. She dressed like a street person. She had a rough life, man, in every way. She'd been in a mental hospital inpatient ward for like years. And she came to me hypothetically because she was afraid of other people. She used to kind of walk up to people like this. She was so shy she couldn't even look at people. And it turned out that the real reason she came, this outpatient clinic that I was working at a place called the Douglas Hospital, she'd been in an inpatient ward. And man, the people in those inpatient wards, they were so devastated. They'd been there for like 30 years. These were people who hadn't been let back on the streets during deinstitutionalization. And so it was like Dante's Inferno walking through those wards, man. And One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had nothing on that place, I tell you. And she had been in that ward, and she had a dog that she took care of, and she had this idea that she could take her dog out for a walk, and that maybe she could take some of those inpatients out for a walk. And that's why she'd come to see me. So you had this woman whose life was, Jesus, man, she was facing an impenetrable wall everywhere she looked, and yet her attitude was, I've met some people who had it worse than me, and maybe there's something I could do to help. It was stunning.
Yep.
And so
those type of people that you meet are so powerful.
Yeah, well, the fact that you're suffering doesn't justify your immorality. And that's, you're called upon to act nobly regardless of your catastrophe. And
not only is
that's
that
a good thing to learn.
Be better for the world. Yeah, it's going to be better for the world around you, and it's going to be better for you. I mean, I don't know that this has been studied or anything, but feeling hatred and being super reactive or sensitive to things that have gone wrong in your life, I truly believe eats away at your body and mind as a person. And all the people that I've met who have been the most powerful in my life have had some of the worst things happen to them. And they approach people with a smile, and they are calm, and they are collected in some of the worst moments you could possibly imagine. And to be able to master that as a person, I think is probably one of the most powerful journeys that I will go on, or anybody will go on in their life.
Well, it has been studied, I would say, to some degree. It depends on how broadly, in some sense, it depends on how far you can see the research extending. So here's an example. There is a trait, neuroticism, which is sensitivity to negative emotion. And that's anxiety and pain, let's say. And people differ in their sensitivity to those at baseline. One of the things that makes people more neurotic, so experience negative emotion, is self-consciousness. And so really what that means is, literally what it means is, the more you think about yourself, the more miserable you are. And so that's worth knowing. So if you're always wondering how the world's treating you, and if you're a victim, and if you're always concerned about your emotional state, you will be miserable, because those concerns are the same thing as being miserable. And so there's that bit of research that bears on this issue. But it's also the case that we know that if you take a stance in life that's predicated on the idea that what you're doing is voluntarily confronting a challenge, then that's completely different psychophysiologically, neurologically, pharmacologically. That's completely different from having a stress thrust upon you. So if you're an active contender, you're actually a different psychophysiological organism than you are if you're a passive recipient, even if it's the same level of challenge. And that'd be the difference between stress and challenge. That's clearly documented, all the way to the cellular level.
Okay, so sitting in the ice bath willingly is better than having ice water thrown at your face.
Well,
what I'm hearing.
In fact, they're not only different, they're opposites. So, and the ice bath idea is an interesting one. I mean, Wim Hof, who's the world's master at ice baths, he's been plunging himself into cold water for decades, and he is so resistant to cold and so in control of his autonomic nervous system that it's kind of miracle. And so, we actually don't know the limit here. So here, I'll tell you something on the religious front that's worth thinking about too, in relationship to this discussion. There's an idea that's deep in Western culture, insofar as Western culture is Christian, is that the world is founded on a sacrifice, right? And that's what the crucifix represents. And European towns were built around a church, and the church was built around an altar, and the altar was built around the idea of sacrifice. So the proper sacrifice is at the center of the community. That's what that idea means. Now, you might ask, well, what's the proper sacrifice? And the answer is something like the voluntary willingness to bear your cross. And then you might say, well, what is your cross? And the answer to that is, well, that's the catastrophe of your life, right? That's the fact you'll be betrayed, the fact that you're going to die, the fact that you're going to be in pain, the fact that your loved ones will see you suffer, the fact that the mob will come after you, the fact that criminals might be preferred to you, etc. It's all the potential catastrophes of your life. And then the sacrifice is the idea that you have to let your, what would you say? You have to let your narrow ego go enough so that you pick all that up voluntarily, all of that. And then that transforms it. And I think that's literally true. I think that's what all the psychological evidence points to, is that if you adopt a stance of voluntary challenge, even in relationship to tragedy and malevolence, that's the pathway to transcendence, truly.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because my mother, she struggles with borderline personality disorder. And in a lot of the therapy that she's underwent, they talk about this deep attachment to traumatic events, and not only the traumatic events of your own life, but of other people's lives. And her attachment to that is often from the perspective of being somebody outside of the traumatic event and bearing no responsibility or accountability. Now, whether that's the illness to blame or your own personal ability to contend with yourself, it truly does change your entire outlook on life. And it can be a very powerful thing to take accountability for actions that maybe had nothing to do with you.
Well, okay, so I've got a practical example of that might be helpful with your relationship. So, and maybe not, but maybe it'll be helpful to someone. So now and then when my wife get into an intractable battle, we'll both have that proclivity to want to be right. So you want to be right because you don't want your beliefs to fall apart, and you want to be right because then you don't have to go through the inconvenience of having to change. So you have your reasons for wanting to be right. The problem with that is you might not be right, and plus you have to live with this other person, and so you better sort out your differences. I don't think that's compromise, by the way. I think that's joint union in a higher vision. But one of the things we learn to do, if we could pull ourselves away from the fight, because you think things like, well, some of the time I'm wrong, but this time she's definitely in the wrong, and I'm going to make that point. And she feels the same way, and so, then we, come to loggerheads. We learn to leave each other and go into our separate rooms and then to meditate for some period of time. And here's the meditation. It's like, okay, we're having this stupid argument. Definitely my wife is wrong this time, for sure. But there's some possibility that I've done something stupid sometime in the recent past, or maybe even in the distant past, that made this argument somewhat more likely, somewhat, even though she's mostly wrong. And so what's so interesting about that is if you sit and you ask yourself that, it's like, what did I do imperfectly to increase the probability of this event? You will absolutely get an answer. You'll get some little fantasy, some memory, some thought about something you did. And then if you go tell the person that, then it takes all that pride out of it. So she'll say, what she did wrong, and I'll say what I did wrong. And then we're both confronting the situation like stupid people who have something to learn instead of like intellectually prideful people who are definitely right. And then we can, so far, inevitably, we've been able to construct a joint vision out of the argument, that's better than either of our a priori positions. And that's also a hallmark of a healthy relationship. It's not like you meet in the middle or that you compromise. It's that you bring the conflict together. It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, essentially. You bring the conflict together and you bring your two viewpoints together and you meld a third viewpoint that's better than either of the viewpoints you brought to bear on the problem. And you can generally do that and having that humility that enables you to examine what stupid thing you did to muck up the relationship. You can meditate on that pretty much forever, right? What stupid thing did you do to muck things up? That's an inexhaustible treasure trove of wisdom, that is.
Right. And one of the worst and most uncomfortable things that we'll have to go through in our life, too. So it's yet another challenge to face in full force, and something I will admittedly say I struggle with.
Well, here's something I learned as a therapist. This is also useful to know. It's not surprising that people shy away from conflict, especially if they're agreeable and somewhat neurotic, because you don't want to have conflict with someone if you're agreeable. And if you're higher in neuroticism, it makes you pretty upset. So you have your reasons not to want to have the discussion. But here's the rub, man, and this is something I learned as a therapist. Conflict delayed is conflict multiplied. Like if you have a problem with you or with your partner, then if you don't sort it out, then you're going to have that bloody problem for the rest of your life. And
absolutely,
maybe it'll be a problem that comes up every week. So that's like 50 times a year, and you're married for 30 years. So you're going to have that problem 1,500 times. 1,500 times. And maybe it'll take an hour per time. So that's 1,500 hours. And so that's 30 work weeks. That's basically a year of work of your life. That's like 2% of your life. So then you think, well, should I have a fight? And the answer is, damn right. Right now, man, 4 hours. Let's hash this out, right? Let's figure out how we're stupid. And then let's figure out how we can not do this again, right? And that we're both buy into, right? Because you have to both buy into it. It has to be voluntary. But you see, so you have that fear of not being right, and you have the fear maybe of having the fight, and you have the fear of discovering what's wrong with you. And fine, those are all valid fears. But you need to balance that against the fear of having the same fight 1,500 times. Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, even worse is just remaining silent and never making that person aware of the problem that you have. I mean, what a disservice to whoever you're in a relationship with for them to remain ignorant to something that you are having such trouble with. It's just a really difficult thing to do, but it must be done.
Yeah, well, it is kind of polite to, one of the things I often hear people say, couples used to say this to each other, because now and then I had couples in my therapy session. I was always concentrating on a particular individual, but sometimes it was useful to have their partner in. People would often say something when they were talking to their partner like, well, if you loved me, you'd know what I wanted. It's like, well, sometimes that's true, and you're not just paying attention, but, first of all, you don't even know what you want. So how the hell would you expect someone else to know? And maybe you could be polite enough to let them in on the secret. That'd be kind of nice. Now, you have to make yourself vulnerable, right? Well, here's the problem with that. If you let me know what you want and need, then I can manipulate you and I can deny that to you, right? See, if I don't know what you want and need, then if I'm going to torture you, it's kind of hit or miss. But if you let me in on the secret, then I know where you're vulnerable and I can really misuse that. And so you have to trust someone to let them know what you want and need. You really have to trust them. And then you might say, well, that's naive to trust like that. But it's not unless you're naive. Once you're past being naive, that sort of trust is courage, not naivety. It's like, I know you could hurt me. I know it. Especially if I tell you this. But I'm going to do it anyways. Because that's an invitation to the best in you. Right? And then maybe we could sort out this problem. And maybe, you'll have the same luxury with me. You'll be able to tell me something that you need and want. And so Absolutely. That's the sort of trust you have to have in a relationship in order for it to progress properly.
And if you don't, I mean, what is your relationship? Who is the person dating if they don't know you, if they don't know your wants and needs? I mean, so often people reach out to me on the political end of the spectrum and say, I'm so scared to come to my friends and tell them that I agree with some of the things that you say. And I'm sure you run into this a lot. But to that, you just say, well, what friends are they if they don't know you and they don't know how you think and feel about certain things? And what are you truly giving people in this relationship? And what are they getting from you in this relationship if they don't know who you are?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. If you're in the grip of an ideology and you're falsifying your own experience to be an agent of that ideology, then it's the ideology that has your life and not you.
Right.
And that really is a form of possession. It's like you don't get to say what you want to say. You don't get to feel what you need to feel. The friends you have don't know who you are. They're not really your friends. They're allies. They're ideological allies. They're really comrades, in some real sense.
Yeah.
And it's a lot better to have friends than comrades by any stretch of the imagination. So.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we're out of time. That went by very quickly. And so for everyone who's listening, I'm going to go over to the Daily Wire Plus platform and talk to Amala some more on the more biographical front. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank all of you who are watching and listening for doing exactly that, and hope you found, especially you young people who might be listening, hope you found this discussion useful in guiding you through the swamps of your philosophical journey. And I hope you found it helpful in terms of helping you find the courage to have your own voice and to find your own friends and to make your own way, in truth, and to be very careful about the pride that goes along with ideological possession. It's a very bad thing. It is definitely the cardinal sin. And so anyways, thanks to all of you who are watching and listening. Thanks, Amala. It was good talking to you. We'll continue on the Daily Wire Plus platform. I'm going to ask Amala a bunch of biographical questions and delve a little bit more into the dark secrets of her past. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, eh? Yeah, you bet. It's a pleasure. Hello, everyone. I would encourage you to continue listening to my conversation with my guest on dailywireplus.com.